One black woman helped a white old man, but she didn't know what would happen next. Ella, a 16-year-old girl, lived in a small town and had a busy morning. She woke up to the sound of birds singing outside her window. The warm sunlight came through her thin curtains and filled her small room with a gentle glow. Ella sat up in bed and stretched, her eyes landing on a faded photograph of her younger self with Mrs. Clark, the kind-hearted woman who ran the orphanage where she had grown up. She took a deep breath, thinking about her day ahead. Ella swung her legs over the edge of the bed and stood up. She walked to her dresser and picked out a simple t-shirt and jeans. As she got dressed, she thought about the orphanage and the kids she would see later. Another day, she whispered to herself with a mix of hope and worry. After getting dressed, she made her way downstairs and out the front door of her foster home. The streets were quiet as she walked the familiar path to the orphanage. Her heart lifted a little when she saw the old brick building come into view. As she approached, she heard the joyful sounds of children playing in the yard. A smile spread across her face, warming her from the inside out. When Ella reached the gate, a group of excited young voices called out to her. Little arms wrapped around her legs, and Ella bent down to hug the children. "Hey everyone, how are you all doing today?" she asked. Mrs. Clark, who had gray hair neatly pulled back and a gentle smile, appeared at the door. "Ella, dear, it's so good to see you," she said warmly. Ella walked over to Mrs. Clark and gave her a hug. "Hi, Mrs. Clark. I thought I'd come by and help out before school." Mrs. Clark's eyes crinkled with affection. "You're always welcome here, sweetheart. You know that." As they walked inside, Mrs. Clark placed a hand on Ella's shoulder. "Do you remember when you first came to us? You were so tiny, but had the biggest heart I'd ever seen." Ella nodded, feeling emotional. "I remember." "You've overcome so much," Mrs. Clark said softly. "I'm so proud of the young woman you've become." Ella felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to believe Mrs. Clark's words, but doubt crept into her mind. "I don't know, Mrs. Clark. Sometimes I feel like I'm not doing enough, like I should be doing more with my life." Mrs. Clark squeezed her shoulder gently. "Oh, Ella, you make a difference every day just by being you. These children look up to you so much." Ella managed a small smile, but inside she still felt uncertain. Her dream of making a real difference in the world seemed so far away. As she prepared to start another ordinary day, she wondered if she would ever find her true purpose. Ella stepped out of the orphanage, her heart heavy with mixed emotions. She checked her pocket for the crumpled shopping list and some cash her foster mom had given her. With a deep breath, she started walking toward the local grocery store. The streets were bustling with activity as she made her way down the sidewalk. Cars zipped by and people rushed past her, all seemingly in a hurry. When she entered the grocery store, the cool air-conditioned breeze hit her face. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the aisles stretched out before her like a maze. Ella grabbed a small basket and began her search for the items on her list. She wandered through the produce section, picking up a bag of apples and some bananas. As she reached for a head of lettuce, her hand accidentally brushed against another person's. She quickly pulled her hand back and said, "Oh, excuse me." The person, a well-dressed woman, barely glanced at her before grabbing the lettuce and moving on. Ella felt a pang in her chest. It was as if she were invisible, just another face in the crowd. As she moved through the aisles, Ella's mind drifted to her uncertain future. She watched a mother and daughter arguing over which cereal to buy and felt a twinge of envy. What would it be like to have a real family? To belong somewhere permanently? Ella picked up a box of pasta and some sauce, her thoughts turning to the limited opportunities she felt were available to her. College seemed like an impossible dream, and she wasn't sure what kind of job she could get without higher education. The weight of her uncertain future felt heavy on her shoulders, making even the simple task of grocery shopping seem overwhelming. Ella passed by a group of teenagers laughing and joking around near the snack aisle. They were probably her age, but Ella felt years older. Her experiences in the foster care system had forced her to grow up quickly, and she often felt out of place among her peers. As she walked into the snack aisle, Ella noticed an elderly blind man standing in front of the biscuit section. His thin white hair and kind, wrinkled face made him look gentle, but he seemed frustrated as he tried to find something on the shelves. He was holding a long cane, and it was clear he was having difficulty. Ella's heart tugged with sympathy. She knew all too well what it felt like to be lost and struggling. For a moment, Ella hesitated. Should she offer to help? What if the man didn't want her assistance? Despite her doubts, she decided to approach him. "Excuse me, sir," Ella said gently. "Can I help you find something?" The man turned towards her, his face lighting up with a grateful smile. "Oh, that would be wonderful. I'm trying to find the oatmeal biscuits, but I can't seem to locate them." Ella looked at the shelves and quickly spotted the biscuits. She reached out and guided his hand to the right box. "Here you go," she said with a smile. The old man's face beamed with relief. "Thank you so much, young lady. You've been a great help." Ella's heart warmed at his words. "You're welcome," she replied. "I'm glad I could help." As she walked away, Ella felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in a long time. Helping the old man made her realize that even small acts of kindness could make a big difference. She left the grocery store with a renewed sense of hope, thinking that maybe, just maybe, she was on the right path to finding her purpose. Little did Ella know, this simple act of kindness would lead to an unexpected surprise that would change her life forever. Ella remembered times when she felt invisible and unwanted, but then she thought about Mrs. Clark's advice on kindness and making a difference, no matter how small. Taking a deep breath, Ella stepped forward and said softly, "Excuse me, sir. I noticed you were looking for something. Can I help you find it?" The old blind man turned toward her voice, looking surprised and relieved. "Oh, hello there," he said with a warm smile. "That's very kind of you. I'm looking for my favorite oatmeal biscuits. I was assisted on the shelf, but I can't seem to find them." Ella smiled shyly and said, "I'd be happy to help you look. What brand are they?" "They're called Golden Oats," the man replied. "They come in a blue box with gold writing." Ella looked at the shelves and soon spotted the blue box with Golden Oats written in shiny gold letters. "I found them," she said, reaching for the box. It was just a little higher up on the shelf. Ella carefully took the box of Golden Oats and gave it to Mr. Johnson. His face lit up with a warm smile as his fingers felt the familiar packaging. "Thank you, my dear," he said with gratitude. "These biscuits mean more to me than you might imagine." Ella felt curious and asked softly, "Really? How come?" Mr. Johnson's eyes seemed to look far away, even though he couldn't see. "My late wife Martha loved these biscuits," he said gently. "Every Sunday afternoon, we'd sit on our porch swing sharing a pack of Golden Oats and a pot of tea. Martha would dunk her biscuit in her tea, letting it soak a bit too long until it broke off into her cup. We'd laugh about it every time." Ella felt a lump in her throat. "That sounds really nice," she said softly. Mr. Johnson nodded, his smile bittersweet. "Those were some of the happiest moments of my life. Now, whenever I eat these biscuits, it's like she's right here with me again." Ella's heart ached with understanding. She thought of the orphanage, Mrs. Clark, and the moments that made her feel at home. "I know what you mean," she said. "Sometimes it's the little things that bring back the best memories." Mr. Johnson turned his face toward her, his expression softening. "You sound like you speak from experience. Have you lost someone too?" Ella hesitated, then replied, "I never really knew my parents, but the people at the orphanage where I grew up are like family to me. Even the smell of the place brings back so many memories." Mr. Johnson patted Ella's hand gently. "Family comes in many forms. It's the love that matters, not the blood." Ella felt tears in her eyes. "Yeah, it really does. she agreed, her voice thick with emotion. As Ella watched Mr. Johnson hold the box of golden oats close to his chest, she felt a warm glow inside her. It wasn't often she made someone else happy, and the feeling was as sweet as the biscuits. "You've been so kind," Mr. Johnson said with genuine gratitude. "It's not just about the biscuits, you know. It's the time you took to listen to an old man's stories." Ella ducked her head, feeling shy. "It was nothing, really," she mumbled. Mr. Johnson shook his head. "No, my dear, it was everything. In this busy world, a moment of kindness is rare and precious." His words touched Ella deeply. She felt her cheeks warm and a small smile on her lips. "I'm glad I could help," she said softly. As they stood there in the snack aisle, surrounded by colorful packages and the hum of the store, Ella felt a strange connection to the kind old man. It was as if the invisible wall that usually separated her from the world had fallen away. Mr. Johnson patted her hand gently. "You have a good heart, young lady. Don't ever lose that." Ella nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. She wanted to say more, but couldn't find the right words. With a final smile and a nod, Mr. Johnson turned and shuffled away, his biscuits tucked safely under his arm. Ella watched him go, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. She took a deep breath and turned back to her shopping cart, ready to finish her errands. As she moved through the store, picking up items, Ella found herself smiling more easily. Her worries felt a little lighter, and the world seemed a bit brighter. She couldn't explain it, but her encounter with Mr. Johnson had lifted her spirits. It was just a small act of kindness, she told herself, but deep down she knew it was more. It was a reminder that she had something valuable to offer the world, even if it was just a moment of compassion. Ella walked through the familiar doors of the orphanage, the scent of chalk and children's laughter filling the air. Her heart lightened as she heard the pitter-patter of little feet rushing toward her. "Ella's here!" a chorus of young voices called out. She knelt down, opening her arms wide as several children ran to hug her. Their warmth and excitement chased away her lingering doubts. "Hey, kiddos," Ella said softly, her smile genuine and bright. "Ready to tackle some homework?" The children nodded eagerly, tugging her toward the study area. Ella settled at a small table surrounded by curious faces and open textbooks. As she helped a young girl with her math problems, Ella's mind drifted back to her encounter with Mr. Johnson. The memory of his kind words and grateful smile made her smile wider. "You look happy today, Ella," one of the boys said, his pencil paused over his workbook. Ella nodded, her eyes sparkling. She wanted to tell the children why they should listen to her. They had put their homework aside to listen. Ella started talking about her trip to the grocery store and an old man she had met. She said he was looking for his wife's favorite biscuits and was very lost. Ella felt happy to help him. She said that sometimes small acts of kindness can make a big difference. The children listened carefully, their eyes wide with wonder. Ella felt happy as she saw their excited faces. She might not know what will happen in her own future, but she felt good about helping them. As the afternoon went on, Ella helped with homework, shared more stories, and listened to the children's own stories. She laughed at their jokes, comforted them when they were sad, and celebrated their little successes. With each moment, Ella felt a new sense of purpose. The children looked up to her, trusted her, and in their eyes, she saw hope for both them and herself. That evening, Ella sat on the edge of her bed in her foster family's home. She thought about the day and hugged her knees to her chest. She closed her eyes and remembered Mr. Johnson's happy face when she found his favorite biscuits. Even though helping him seemed small, it made her feel warm inside. Ella sighed and looked out the window at the stars. She wondered if her life would always be about small acts of kindness and short connections. She wanted something more, something big. But how could she make that happen when she was just a foster kid from a small town? The future seemed hard and unclear. Still, thinking about the children at the orphanage and how they looked up to her gave her a tiny bit of hope. Maybe these small acts of kindness were building something bigger. Ella traced patterns on her bedspread, feeling both hopeful and doubtful. She wondered if Mr. Johnson was enjoying his biscuits and if her small act had made his day better. As she got ready for bed, she felt both heavy and light. She was unsure about the future, but remembering the smiles she brought to others made her feel better. She climbed into bed with many thoughts about what might come next. The next morning, Ella woke up to birds chirping outside her window. She stretched and yawned, still a little sleepy. As she got ready for the day, she couldn't stop thinking about the mix of hope and uncertainty from the night before. Ella walked to the orphanage, excited to see the children. But when she got there, she saw Mrs. Clark standing at the entrance with a serious face. "Ella, dear," Mrs. Clark called, her voice tight. "Could you come to my office, please?" Ella's heart skipped a beat. She felt nervous and wondered if she had done something wrong. She followed Mrs. Clark down the hallway, her mind racing with worries. The silence between them made her feel even more anxious. When they reached Miss Clark's office, it felt different than usual, colder. Mrs. Clark sat at her desk with her hands folded, looking serious. "Please sit down, Ella," she said, pointing to the chair in front of her. Ella sat down, feeling weak. She clasped her hands to keep them from shaking. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet room. Mrs. Clark took a deep breath and looked at Ella. Ella's heart pounded because she could tell this was important. Mrs. Clark started to speak. Mrs. Clark sat across from Ella, her voice steady but serious. "There's something important we need to talk about," she began. Ella's heart raced as she looked at Mrs. Clark's concerned face. But then, Mrs. Clark's expression softened into a warm smile. "I have some extraordinary news," she said, her voice filled with a mix of excitement and disbelief. "The orphanage has just received an anonymous donation, and Ella, it's in your name." Ella's eyes widened in shock. Her mouth fell open as she stammered, In my name?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Mrs. Clark nodded, her smile growing wider. "Yes, and it's not just any donation. It's the largest amount we've ever received, more money than we've seen in all the years I've been here." Ella felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the news. How could this be possible? Who would do such a thing? But why me?" Ella asked, her voice trembling. "I don't understand. I haven't done anything special." Mrs. Clark reached across the desk and gently patted Ella's hand. "Clearly, someone out there thinks very highly of you, my dear. Someone who believes in you and wants to support not just you, but all the children here." Ella's thoughts whirled. She thought of all the faces she had seen recently. The children at the orphanage, the shoppers at the grocery store, Mr. Johnson with his biscuits. Had one of them done this? But how and why? It's too much," Ella said, feeling overwhelmed. Tears pricked at her eyes, a mix of confusion and gratitude washing over her. "I don't deserve this." "Oh, Ella," Mrs. Clark said, her voice warm and reassuring. "You've always been so quick to help others, so kind and selfless. Perhaps this is the universe's way of giving back to you." Ella sat in stunned silence, trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. The idea that someone out there, someone she might not even know, thought so highly of her to make such a generous gift was almost too much to comprehend. Ella sat in Mrs. Clark's office, her mind reeling from the news. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was all a dream, and at any moment she'd wake up and find herself back in her small bedroom, facing another ordinary day. I can't believe it," Ella said softly, shaking her head. "Are you sure it's not a mistake?" Mrs. Clark smiled gently. "No mistake, Ella. The donation is real and it's in your name." As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Ella's thoughts drifted to the day before. She remembered her encounter with Mr. Johnson at the grocery store and how lost he had looked searching for his wife's favorite biscuits. It had been such a small thing, helping him find them, listening to his story. Could that simple act of kindness have led to this? Mrs. Clark, Ella began hesitantly, do you think it could be possible that someone I helped recently did this? The older woman tilted her head, considering. It's certainly possible, Ella. Your kindness touches more people than you realize. Ella's mind raced with possibilities. She thought of Mr. Johnson's grateful smile and the warmth in his eyes as he thanked her. But surely a stranger wouldn't make such a generous donation based on one small interaction, would they? But who would do something like this? Ella wondered aloud. And why me? As she sat there, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of the orphanage, Ella felt as if her world had suddenly expanded. The future that had once seemed so limited now stretched out before her, full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Yet with those possibilities came questions. Who was this mysterious benefactor? What did they want? And how would this change her life and the lives of the children she cared about so deeply? Ella's heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. She thought of all the children in the orphanage and how this money could help them. But she also thought of herself and the dreams she had tucked away, thinking they were out of reach. What happens now? Ella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ella took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing thoughts. She looked up at Mrs. Clark, determination shining in her eyes. Mrs. Clark, is there anything else you can tell me about the donation? Any clue at all? She asked, leaning forward in her chair. Mrs. Clark shook her head, her brow furrowed. I'm afraid not, Ella. The only thing we know for certain is that it was made specifically in your name. That's what makes it so unusual. Ella nodded slowly, her mind whirling with questions. And you're sure there's no note or message from the donor? Nothing? Mrs. Clark confirmed. It's as much a mystery to me as it is to you. Ella stood up and began to pace the small office, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was somehow connected to her encounter with Mr. Johnson. But how could that be? It seemed too incredible to be true. Maybe it was someone from my past, Ella wondered aloud, a relative I never knew about. Mrs. Clark's eyes softened with sympathy. It's possible, but we shouldn't get our hopes up about that. Remember, we've never been able to find any of your relatives. Ella nodded, trying to push away the familiar ache that came with thoughts of her unknown family. She turned her mind back to the mystery at hand. What if it was someone I helped recently? She mused. Like Mr. Johnson from the grocery store? The elderly gentleman you told me about? Mrs. Clark asked. It seems unlikely that a stranger would make such a large donation based on one interaction, but I suppose anything's possible. Ella's mind raced with other possibilities. Could it be someone from school? A secret millionaire who had been watching her? Each idea seemed more far-fetched than the last, but she couldn't help herself. The mystery of it all was both exciting and overwhelming. I just can't believe someone would do this for me, Ella said softly, more to herself than to Mrs. Clark. Why me? Mrs. Clark stood up and placed a gentle hand on Ella's shoulder. Because you're special, Ella. You have a kind heart and a giving spirit. Someone clearly saw that in you and wanted to help. Feeling a warmth spread through her chest at Mrs. Clark's words, Ella might not know who the mysterious donor was, but their belief in her made her feel valued in a way she never had before. Ella couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Johnson was somehow connected to the mysterious donation. With determination in her step, she made her way to the grocery store where they had met. Her heart raced with anticipation as she pushed through the automatic doors. The familiar aisles stretched out before her, filled with shoppers going about their day. Ella's eyes scanned each face, hoping to catch a glimpse of Mr. Johnson's kind smile. She retraced her steps to the snack aisle where they had first met, but found only strangers browsing the shelves. Undeterred, Ella began a systematic search of the store. She walked up and down each aisle, her gaze darting from person to person. She checked the bakery, the produce section, even the frozen foods. She left no area unexplored, but Mr. Johnson was nowhere to be found. As time passed, Ella's hope began to fade. She approached a young cashier and mustered her courage to ask about Mr. Johnson. "Excuse me," Ella said softly. "I'm looking for an elderly gentleman who shops here. He has white hair and likes a specific brand of biscuits. Have you seen him recently?" The cashier furrowed her brow, thinking for a moment. "I'm sorry, but I don't think I've seen anyone matching that description. We get a lot of customers, though. Maybe try asking our manager." Ella nodded, thanking the cashier before seeking out the store manager. She repeated her question, providing as much detail as she could. The manager shook his head and said he hadn't seen anyone matching that description either. Ella left the store feeling disheartened. She still couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Johnson was somehow connected to the donation, but without more information, she had no way of knowing for sure. As she walked away from the grocery store, she couldn't help but wonder about the mysterious benefactor and what their gesture truly meant for her future. Ella had hoped to find Mr. Johnson, but the store manager couldn't help her. "I'm sorry, miss," he said with a sad smile. "We respect our customers' privacy, and I don't remember anyone who matches that description." Feeling let down, Ella thanked him and left the store. She stood outside, watching people come and go, hoping Mr. Johnson would show up, but he didn't. As time passed, Ella had to accept that Mr. Johnson seemed to be gone. Even though her search didn't find him, something changed inside her. The thought that someone believed in her enough to give such a generous gift made her feel hopeful. For the first time in a long while, Ella felt a small spark of hope. She walked back to the orphanage feeling a bit lighter. Helping Mrs. Clark with some paperwork, Ella saw her reflection in the window. She noticed that she wasn't just another face anymore. She had inspired a kind act. Mrs. Clark noticed Ella's distraction and said, "Whoever gave the donation must have seen something special in you." Ella felt warm inside. "Do you really think so?" she asked softly. Mrs. Clark nodded and said, "I've always known you were special. It's nice to see someone else see it too." Ella thought about Mrs. Clark's words all day. When she spent time with the younger kids, she talked more confidently and shared stories of kindness, encouraging them to believe in themselves like someone had believed in her. As days passed, Ella saw herself in a new light. She wasn't just a girl from the orphanage. She was someone who could inspire others and make a difference. This change was small but noticeable, in the way she walked, her warm smile, and the way she spoke to others. She became more involved with the orphanage, which now felt like a place full of possibilities. She threw herself into the renovation plans with excitement, discussing colors and furniture with Mrs. Clark. "What do you think about turning the old storage room into a study area?" Ella suggested one day, her voice full of new confidence. Mrs. Clark smiled and said, "That's a great idea, Ella. Why don't you lead that project?" Ella was thrilled and spent hours picking out desks and bookshelves to make a nice space for the kids. She shared her ideas with them, and little Sarah, a shy 7-year-old, asked if she could help paint. Ella felt happy and said, "Of course, we'll make it beautiful together." Over the weeks, Ella noticed how the kids looked at her with admiration. She heard one of the boys say he wanted to be like her when he grew up. This surprised Ella. She had never seen herself as a role model before. As she watched the kids help with the renovations and mimic her excitement, she realized she had become someone others looked up to. This made Ella proud and gave her a sense of purpose. Even though she was becoming more confident, she still felt her journey wasn't complete. She wanted to thank her mysterious donor, so she kept going back to the grocery store, hoping to see Mr. Johnson. Each visit brought a small hope, but he was always missing, like a ghost. As weeks turned into months, Ella's search became more about understanding her own worth. She often lingered in the snack aisle where she had first met Mr. Johnson, thinking about their conversation. Ella had always admired the way Mr. Johnson, a kind old man, had been so supportive of her and the orphanage. She often wondered why he had seen something special in her that she didn't see in herself. As she helped customers at the store, she thought of him and tried to live up to the kindness he had shown her. Each small act of kindness she performed felt like a tribute to Mr. Johnson, who had believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. His faith in her had become a guiding light, helping her recognize the value of her own compassion and willingness to help others. One afternoon, while working in the snack aisle, Ella had a moment of reflection. It was a quiet day, and the store was calm. An elderly woman approached her with a soft voice, asking for help to reach a high shelf. Ella smiled warmly and stretched to get the item for the woman. As she did so, she glanced at the store's security mirror and saw her own reflection. For a brief moment, she saw herself as Mr. Johnson might have seen her, kind, capable, and full of potential. This realization filled her with a deep sense of appreciation for Mr. Johnson's impact on her life. Even though she might never see him again, his influence had left a lasting impression on her heart. The orphanage where Ella worked was undergoing a big renovation. She spent a lot of time sorting through old boxes and forgotten items as part of the project. One day, while humming to herself in a small storage room, she stumbled upon something interesting. She found an old photograph in a simple wooden frame hidden in the corner. As she dusted off the frame, her heart skipped a beat. The photograph was of a much younger Mr. Johnson, smiling with a woman who was likely his wife. They were standing in front of a small house, looking very happy. Ella's fingers trembled as she traced the outlines of their faces. The inscription on the back of the photo read, "To my dearest Margaret, may our love always have a home. Love, Edward." Ella was excited and surprised to learn Mr. Johnson's first name was Edward. The word home in the note struck a deep chord in her heart. It made her wonder if the orphanage had a special place in Mr. Johnson's heart, and if there was a reason for his generous donation. She held on to the photograph tightly, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. This discovery seemed like it could be the key to understanding the mysterious donation Mr. Johnson had made. Determined to find out more, Ella hurried to Mrs. Clark's office. Mrs. Clark was busy looking over renovation plans when Ella arrived, slightly out of breath. "Mrs. Clark, I found something important," Ella said, trying to catch her breath. Mrs. Clark looked up with raised eyebrows, curious about what Ella had found. Ella carefully placed the photograph on Mrs. Clark's desk. "I think this might help us understand the donation," she said. Mrs. Clark picked up the frame and adjusted her glasses to get a better look. As she recognized the faces in the photograph, she gasped softly, "Oh my, it's Edward Johnson and his wife, Margaret." Ella's heart leaped at Mrs. Clark's reaction. "You know them?" she asked eagerly. Mrs. Clark nodded, a fond smile spreading across her face. "Yes, Mr. Johnson has been a supporter of our orphanage for many years. He was such a kind man, always thinking of the children. He and Margaret used to visit occasionally, bringing small gifts and spending time with the kids. Their donations were modest, but their hearts were always in the right place." Ella felt warmth spreading through her chest. "Did they have children of their own?" she asked. Mrs. Clark shook her head. "No, they didn't have children, but they cared deeply for all children, especially those without families. In a way, the children here became their family." As Mrs. Clark spoke, Ella began to understand the connection between Mr. Johnson and the orphanage. It made sense why Mr. Johnson had been so kind to her and why he had made such a generous donation. Ella recalled how Mr. Johnson had been touched by the small act of kindness she had shown him in the store. It all seemed to fit together. Ella then shared her thoughts with Mrs. Clark. "I think Mr. Johnson might be our anonymous donor," she said softly. Mrs. Clark looked thoughtful. You might be right. It would be just like Edward to do something so generous, especially if he was moved by an act of kindness. Ella felt a surge of emotion. She realized how powerful a simple act of kindness could be. It made her appreciate even more the kindness Mr. Johnson had shown her and the impact it had on her life. As the renovation of the orphanage continued, Ella found herself at the center of the changes. New paint brightened the walls, new furniture replaced the old, and the playground equipment sparkled in the sunlight. Ella was busy coordinating volunteers and offering ideas for the improvements. The orphanage was transforming into a better place for the children, and Ella felt proud to be a part of it. Ella was arranging books in the new library when Mrs. Clark came over with an envelope. Ella, I have some news for you, Mrs. Clark said with a big smile. Ella put down the book and looked at Mrs. Clark. What is it? She asked. Mrs. Clark handed her the envelope and said, You've been invited to speak at the community event. They want you to talk about growing up at the orphanage. Ella's eyes got big as she read the invitation. She felt excited but also scared. Me? Speak in front of people? She asked. Mrs. Clark nodded and said, Yes, they heard about your work on the library and how you inspire the younger kids. Ella felt both proud and nervous. I don't know if I can do this, she said quietly. Mrs. Clark gently put her hand on Ella's shoulder and said, I believe in you. This is a great chance for you to share your story and inspire others. Ella thought about everything that had happened recently and wondered if she was ready. Do you really think I'm ready? She asked. Mrs. Clark smiled and said, Yes, your story is powerful and can help others. Ella felt a bit braver and decided to do it. Okay, she said with a small smile. I'll give the speech. On the day of the event, Ella was backstage feeling nervous. She held her notes tightly, her hands sweaty. The room was full of people, including families, leaders, and some children from the orphanage. Mrs. Clark gave her a reassuring hug and pushed her gently towards the stage. You've got this, she whispered. Ella took a deep breath and went out to the stage. The crowd went silent, looking at her. At first, Ella felt scared, but then she saw the younger kids from the orphanage smiling at her. That helped her start speaking. Hello, she began, her voice shaky but getting stronger. My name is Ella, and I grew up in the local orphanage. As she talked, Ella's nerves went away. She shared stories about her childhood, the hard times, and the happy moments. When she talked about the anonymous donation that helped them, her voice got emotional. This act of kindness changed everything, she said with tears in her eyes. It showed me that one person can make a difference, and that small acts of kindness can help many people. The audience listened closely, and many people were crying. Ella felt happy knowing her story was making a difference. At the end of her speech, everyone clapped loudly. Ella felt amazed and saw Mrs. Clark and the younger kids cheering for her. She realized that sharing her story could inspire others. After the event, many people came up to her to say how great her speech was. A woman named Sarah from the local newspaper came up and said, Hi, I'm Sarah. Your speech was amazing. I want to write a story about you and the orphanage. Would you do an interview? Ella was surprised, but excited. She agreed and said, Yes, I'd like that. It can help more people understand what the orphanage means. Ella talked with Sarah a few times, sharing stories about her life, the donation, and the changes at the orphanage. When the article was published, many people in the community started talking about the orphanage. Ella had worked hard to help the orphanage, and her efforts didn't go unnoticed. As news spread about what she was doing, many people wanted to get involved. More volunteers began showing up at the orphanage, and local businesses started offering donations and support. Ella found herself receiving many phone calls and emails from people who wanted to help or learn more about her story. At first, she felt overwhelmed by all the attention. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the sudden influx of interest was a lot to handle. However, as Ella saw how her story inspired others to get involved and make a difference, she began to accept her new role with more confidence. She realized that by sharing her experiences, she was giving a voice to all the children at the orphanage. This realization helped her embrace the attention and use it to continue making a positive impact. The story of Ella and the orphanage continued to gain traction. Local media outlets picked up the story, and soon Ella was being invited to speak at schools and community events. Each time she shared her story, she felt her confidence growing. She began to see how her journey was inspiring others and encouraging them to make a difference in their own ways. Ella noticed that her life was changing in ways she had never imagined. The local newspaper article had sparked a wave of interest and support that seemed to grow every day. Donations started pouring into the orphanage, ranging from small personal contributions to significant gifts from local businesses. Mrs. Clark, who ran the orphanage, was deeply moved by the community's response. One afternoon, with tears in her eyes, she told Ella, "Look at what you've started. We can finally give these children the resources they deserve." Ella felt a mix of pride and disbelief. She had never imagined that her simple act of kindness could lead to such profound changes. As the story of Ella continued to spread, she was invited to speak at various events, including schools, community centers, and even a local TEDx conference. At first, the idea of speaking in front of large audiences terrified her, but with each event, she found her voice becoming stronger and her message clearer. During one particularly moving speech at a high school, Ella looked out at the sea of faces and saw herself reflected in their eyes. They were young people full of potential, just waiting for someone to believe in them. It was in that moment that Ella truly began to believe in her own potential and the difference she could make in the world. Her foster parents noticed the change in her too. One evening, her foster mother remarked, "You're walking taller these days. It's like you found your purpose." Ella smiled, realizing that her foster mother was right. She had found a purpose, a way to make a real difference in the lives of others. Yet, amid all these positive changes, Ella couldn't stop thinking about the anonymous donor who had made such a big impact with their generous gift. She wondered if it was Mr. Johnson, the elderly blind man she had helped find his lost biscuits. The mystery of who had made the donation left a small gap in her newfound confidence. It was a piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. One sunny afternoon, as Ella walked through town, her mind was still buzzing with thoughts of the mysterious donation. She spotted a familiar figure sitting on a park bench near the orphanage. It was Mr. Johnson. Ella's heart skipped a beat. After weeks of searching and wondering, here he was, calm and serene as if he had been waiting for her all along. "Mr. Johnson," Ella called out as she quickened her pace. "I've been hoping to see you again." Mr. Johnson looked up with a warm smile. "Well, hello there, Ella," he said. "What a pleasant surprise. Would you care to join me?" Ella nodded eagerly and sat down beside him. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the leaves rustle in the gentle breeze. Ella took a deep breath and cautiously broached the subject that had been on her mind. "Mr. Johnson, I wanted to ask you about something," she began. "The orphanage received a large donation recently, and I couldn't help but wonder." She trailed off, unsure how to continue. Mr. Johnson turned his head slightly in her direction, his eyes twinkling with a mix of wisdom and mischief. He simply smiled, neither confirming nor denying his involvement. "You know, Ella," he said, "the greatest gift I could ever receive is seeing someone with a heart like yours make a difference in the world." Ella felt a warm feeling spread through her chest at his words. She had always believed that small acts of kindness mattered, but hearing it expressed this way made it feel even more significant. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she blinked them back. not wanting to show how deeply his words had touched her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "That means a lot to me." The old man smiled a gentle, knowing smile. "Keep being who you are, Ella. The world needs more people like you." Ella felt a lump in her throat as Mr. Johnson spoke. He said that even a small act of kindness can change lives, and Ella had done just that. His words made her feel very emotional. She realized that Mr. Johnson, whether he was the donor or not, had given her something more valuable than money. He helped her see how important and capable she was. Ella listened closely, feeling a strong connection with this kind old man who had changed her life. She softly said, "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Even if you're not the donor, you've made a huge difference in my life." That day in the grocery store, it wasn't just about the biscuits. It was about feeling noticed and valued. Mr. Johnson smiled and gently patted her hand, saying, "You've always mattered. Sometimes we just need a reminder of that." Ella wiped away a tear and said, "I've learned so much about myself and kindness since then. It's like you showed me a door I didn't know was there." Mr. Johnson chuckled. "Doors can be hidden, but once we see them, it's up to us to go through." As they sat in the warm sunlight, Ella felt at peace. She understood that the real gift was believing in herself. She said, "I used to think I needed to know who the donor was to thank them properly, but now I see that spreading kindness is the best way to show gratitude." Mr. Johnson smiled proudly. "Exactly right." When Ella stood to leave, she felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. She was at peace with the mystery of the donor and had found a renewed sense of purpose. As the orphanage renovations were almost done, Ella was busy with the finishing touches. The old building looked brand new with fresh paint and bright decorations. Mrs. Adams asked Ella one day if she would cut the ribbon at the reopening ceremony. Ella was surprised and asked, "Really?" Mrs. Adams smiled and said, "You've become a leader. The children and community look up to you. It's only right you do this." On the day of the ceremony, Ella stood proudly in front of the newly renovated orphanage. She felt both nervous and proud as she saw the crowd of familiar faces, including the children she loved. Holding the big scissors with shaking hands, she cut the ribbon. The crowd cheered, and Ella felt immense joy. She saw the children running inside, laughing and playing with the new toys and books. More than the new things, she saw the happy faces of the children, full of hope. Ella realized she had helped create a place where kids like her could dream of a bright future. The ceremony was a big success, with lots of people, including Mr. Johnson, who smiled from the back. When it was time for Ella to speak, she felt confident. She told everyone that the building was more than just bricks and mortar. Ella had worked hard to transform the orphanage into a place full of joy and life. The renovation had been a huge success, and the day of the celebration was a chance for everyone to see the changes. As Ella shared her story about how the orphanage was transformed, she noticed many people in the audience were touched by her words. Some had tears in their eyes, and Ella could see that her story had deeply moved them. Her speech was a reminder of how small acts of kindness could create big changes in the world. After the ceremony, Ella was surrounded by a crowd of people wanting to congratulate her. Local news reporters approached her for interviews, eager to hear more about her journey and the changes she had made. Community leaders praised her for her hard work and dedication, and the children at the orphanage looked at her with admiration. Ella felt a warm feeling spread through her chest, a sense of purpose and belonging she had never felt before. It was a new experience for her, seeing the impact of her efforts and feeling so appreciated. As the day came to an end, Ella found a quiet moment to reflect on everything that had happened. She looked out over the orphanage, now filled with laughter and energy, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future filled with possibilities. She envisioned herself continuing to make a difference, not just in her small town, but maybe on an even larger scale. The shy and uncertain girl she had once been seemed far away now. She stood tall, her head held high, feeling a surge of confidence. She realized that she had the power to shape her own future and to positively impact the lives of others. As Ella retreated to her room, her heart was full and her mind buzzed with the day's events. Still in her best clothes, she noticed an envelope on her nightstand. It was crisp and white with her name written in elegant handwriting. Curious, Ella picked up the envelope and carefully opened it. Inside, she found a neatly folded letter. As she unfolded the paper, her hands trembled slightly with anticipation. The letter was from the anonymous donor who had helped fund the orphanage. Ella's heart raced as she read the first lines. "Dear Ella, your kindness in the grocery store that day touched my heart more than you could ever know. In that simple act of helping an old man find his favorite biscuits, you showed a compassion and empathy that is rare in this world." Ella's eyes widened as she continued reading. The letter explained that the donation to the orphanage had been made in her name, inspired by her selfless act of kindness. The letter continued, "I want you to know that your ability to see the best in others and to offer help without hesitation is truly remarkable. I hope this letter encourages you to continue following your heart. Never doubt the power of your actions, for they can change lives in ways you may never fully realize. The world needs more people like you, Ella. Keep shining your light and know that your kindness ripples out far beyond what you can see." Tears welled up in Ella's eyes as she finished reading. She clutched the letter to her chest, overwhelmed by the confirmation of what she had suspected but hardly dared to believe. The anonymous donor had been touched by her simple act of kindness in the grocery store. Ella's mind swirled with emotions, gratitude, amazement, and a newfound sense of purpose. The letter had not only confirmed the source of the donation, but also affirmed her worth and the impact of her actions. Ella read the letter again, her fingers tracing the words on the page. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but these were tears of joy and overwhelming gratitude. She felt a warmth spreading through her chest, a sense of validation and purpose she had never experienced before. As she sat there, clutching the letter, she realized something profound. The money from the donation had helped the orphanage, but it wasn't the most important part of the journey. It was her character, her kindness, and her willingness to help others that had truly made a difference. Ella thought back to that day in the grocery store when she had felt small and insignificant. Yet, that simple act of helping Mr. Johnson had set off a chain of events that changed not only her life, but also the lives of many others. Ella carefully folded the letter and placed it in a small, ornate box that Mrs. Clark had given her for her 16th birthday. She treated the letter like a precious treasure, knowing it would serve as a reminder of the power of small acts of kindness and their impact on the world. As she closed the drawer, Ella felt a renewed sense of purpose. She realized that she didn't need grand gestures or lots of money to make a difference. Her own actions, no matter how small, had the power to create ripples of change. Looking at herself in the mirror, Ella saw not just the shy girl from the orphanage, but a young woman capable of inspiring others and making a real difference in the world. She smiled, feeling a newfound confidence and determination. With the mystery of the anonymous donor solved, Ella felt a new sense of direction. She no longer saw herself as just a girl from the orphanage, but as someone who could make a significant impact in her community. The letter became a constant source of inspiration, reminding her of the power of kindness and the impact of small actions. Ella began to think about her future and how she continued to help others. She realized that her experiences and recent events had given her a unique perspective that could be valuable to her community. With newfound confidence, Ella decided to reach out to local leaders and organizations to discuss potential projects. One sunny afternoon, she met with Mayor Thompson and several community board members at the town hall. As she walked into the meeting room, she felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. The old Ella might have shrunken away from such an important gathering, but now she stood tall, ready to share her ideas. "Thank you all for meeting with me," Ella began, her voice steady and clear. "I've seen firsthand how small acts of kindness can create big changes, and I want to explore ways we can continue making a difference." Ella was excited as she walked into the town hall. Mayor Thompson was sitting at a big table with some other important people. Ella was a little nervous, but also eager to share her ideas. She wanted to help the community, and she had a plan. Ella had been thinking about ways to make things better. She remembered how she had helped at the orphanage and how it had made a difference. So she came up with two ideas. First, she wanted to start a special program where older kids could help younger kids learn new things and have fun together. She knew how important it was to have someone to look up to and learn from. Her second idea was to have regular days where everyone in the community would come together to help people who needed it. Ella had seen how good it felt to work as a team and wanted others to feel the same way. When Ella shared her ideas with Mayor Thompson and the other people, they listened carefully. They started nodding and smiling, which made Ella feel more confident. They asked her questions and added their own ideas to make her plans even better. The meeting that Ella had been worried about turned into a fun and exciting brainstorming session. By the end, Mayor Thompson agreed to support Ella's ideas, and some of the people even volunteered to help make her plans a reality. As Ella left the town hall, she felt a big sense of pride and happiness. She had done something important and people were ready to help her. She couldn't wait to see how her ideas would help the community. When Ella walked back to the orphanage, she felt a mix of emotions. The orphanage was her home, and it had always smelled like cleaning supplies and home-cooked meals. But today, something felt different. As she walked down the hallway, she noticed the younger kids looking at her with curiosity. "Ella," a small voice called out. It was Sophie, one of the youngest girls at the orphanage. Sophie ran up to Ella, her pigtails bouncing with every step. "Did you really talk to Mayor Thompson?" Ella smiled warmly and knelt down to Sophie's level. "Yes, I did, sweetie. We talked about ways to make our community even better." A group of kids gathered around Ella, their eyes wide with excitement and admiration. Ella looked at their faces and remembered how she used to be just like them, unsure about her place in the world and needing guidance. She had come a long way since then, and now she had the chance to help others just like she had been helped. Ella sat down in the common room with the children surrounding her. They were eager to hear more about the meeting. Ella started to share her experience, and she saw that the children were hanging on to every word she said. She noticed the hope in their eyes, the same hope that had been kindled in her heart. As she spoke, Ella realized how important it was to guide these kids. They looked up to her as a mentor and a leader. They saw in her what she had once struggled to see in herself: strength, kindness, and the power to make a difference. Ella felt a strong sense of duty to show them that their circumstances didn't define their worth or their potential. As the evening went on and the kids began to go to dinner, Ella found a quiet moment for herself. She looked around the orphanage and saw the fresh paint on the walls and the new furniture that had been bought with an anonymous donation. But more than the physical changes, Ella noticed the change in the children's spirits. They seemed happier and more hopeful. In that quiet moment, Ella made a promise to herself and to the children. She would always be there for them, just as others had been there for her when she needed help. She would be the mentor she wished she had when she was younger. She wanted to show the kids that kindness and perseverance could open doors they had never imagined. As Ella stood outside the newly renovated orphanage, she looked at the building with a sense of wonder. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the place that had been her home for so many years. She thought back to the day she felt invisible in the grocery store. Now, she was far from invisible. She had become a beacon of hope for the children inside. Her small act of kindness had inspired an anonymous donation that changed everything. Ella felt excited about the future. She had meetings with local leaders, plans for new programs, and opportunities to inspire others with her story. She knew she had a big responsibility, but it wasn't a burden, it was a gift. She had found her purpose and her place in the world. With a heart full of gratitude and determination, Ella turned back towards the orphanage. She was ready to continue her journey, to keep making a difference in both big and small ways. As she walked through the doors, she remembered the most important lesson of all. When you lead with kindness, the world responds with opportunities you never imagined. Do you think a single act of kindness, like Ella's to Mr. Johnson, can truly change someone's life? Yes or no? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to my channel. I spend hours writing these heartwarming stories for you, and your support means everything to me.